The concrete had come down at 4:47 in the morning. By the time the emergency crews got their lights on the scene, the overpass over Route 14 outside Gallatin, Tennessee had deposited 3 support columns and approximately 40 tons of roadway onto the embankment below, and the consensus among the first responders was that nothing alive had been underneath it when it fell. They were wrong. Nora Voss had heard the collapse from the parking lot of the 24-hour gas station a quarter-mile east, where she had stopped to fill the tank and let Recon out to relieve himself in the strip of grass beside the building. The sound had been a specific kind of thunder, not a single crack, but a long, compressing roar with a secondary impact at the end, the way a structure sounds when it surrenders rather than breaks. Recon had gone absolutely still the moment it started. He was still standing there, ears forward, body locked, when the dust cloud rolled down Route 14 and the gas station fluorescents flickered once and held. Nora had not waited for the sirens. She had clipped Recon's lead, looked at the dog, and said one word. "Find, before we continue, tell us where you're watching from in the comments below. If this story moves you, please subscribe and stay with us until the very end. What Recon found in that rubble, and what he refused to do after he found it, is something that will not leave you easily. We read every single comment, and we want to know how far this story reaches." Nora Voss was 34 years old, and she was, at the time of that night in Gallatin, one of fewer than 50 women to have completed basic underwater demolition/SEAL training at Naval Amphibious Base Coronado. She stood 5 feet 8 inches, with a lean, functional build that contained no excess of anything. No wasted motion, no wasted word, no wasted strength. Her hair was dark brown and worn pulled back, and her face was angular and direct, with a vertical scar through the outer edge of her left eyebrow from a piece of door frame caught in a blast during a Mosul clearance operation in 2021. Her eyes were a pale gray blue, the color of lake water just before it freezes, and they moved through any space with the same systematic, unhurried attention. Exits, hands, shadows, angles that had been trained into them over 15 years and that no amount of civilian life had successfully overwritten. She had served 3 combat deployments with a joint special operations task force across Iraq and Syria, 2 of them in direct action roles, and 1 in a sensitive site exploitation capacity she was not at liberty to describe. She had come home from her last rotation with a commendation she was not permitted to discuss, and a shrapnel injury to her left calf that had healed fully functional, but that she could feel on cold mornings as a faint reminder that the body keeps its own records. She had separated from active duty 14 months ago, not under pressure, not under protest, but with the particular clarity of someone who has looked honestly at what the next 10 years would cost and decided the debt was no longer one she was willing to pay. She had moved to a rented house outside Gallatin, started contract work with a private security consulting firm in Nashville, and spent her first 6 months of civilian life learning, with some difficulty, how to sleep past 5. Recon had been beside her through the final deployment, through the separation process, through the consulting work, and through the difficult months in between. He was a 5-year-old German shepherd with a coat that ran from deep sable along his back to a rich amber tan across his chest and legs, and he weighed 74 pounds of concentrated, deliberate intelligence. His left front leg bore a titanium plate inside it from the Eid strike in Syria in the summer of 2022, an event that Nora still did not describe in much detail, and that the dog carried without any visible acknowledgement beyond the occasional morning stiffness she watched him walk off in the first minutes after rising. He moved with a fluid, ground-covering efficiency that the plate had not diminished, though Nora had been told it likely would in time, and she chose not to think about that on most days. He was not a working dog in the sense of an animal that works for you. He was a working dog in the sense of a partner who works alongside you. which is a distinction that matters enormously to people who have made that particular kind of partnership and cannot be fully explained to people who have not. The rubble field beneath the collapsed overpass covered roughly 120 feet of embankment. The dust was still settling when Nora and Recon reached the scene, and the emergency vehicles were still coming. She could hear the sirens, close and multiplying, but not yet there. The concrete debris was immense in the dark, irregular slabs and broken rebar and crushed gravel piled in the chaotic geometry that only catastrophic structural failure produces. No logic to it, no pattern, the kind of disorder that resists even experienced eyes. The October cold bit hard at the base of the embankment where the ground was wet from the drainage ditch, and the sole working streetlight on the Route 14 shoulder threw a long, pale column of light across the near edge of the fall zone that made the rest of it darker by contrast. The embankment itself had a depression in it below the primary fall zone where the drainage ditch ran, and it was toward this depression that Recon moved with a directness that was not urgency, but certainty. The particular quality of a dog who has already processed the information and is done deliberating. The air smelled of concrete dust and torn earth, and something beneath both of those, something organic and old, like a space that had been inhabited for a long time and carried the residue of that occupation in its soil. Recon reached the edge of the largest concrete slab, a piece of roadway approximately 12 feet across, canted at a 40-degree angle against the embankment, and stopped. He looked back at Nora once. Then, he lowered himself to the ground and pressed his muzzle into a gap between the slab's edge and the gravel beneath it, and whined, one short note, controlled and deliberate. Nora was at his side in 4 strides. She lowered herself beside him and pressed her ear to the gap. She heard breathing, slow, present, real fire and rescue. "I need you on the west end of the fall zone." She was already on the radio before she finished the sentence, crouched in the dust and the dark beside a dog who had found, in a pile of 40 tons of collapsed infrastructure, one living person. "I've got a survivor, alive under the primary slab." Move what came out from under that slab 47 minutes later, after the rescue crew had shored the concrete and extracted him on a backboard, was a man who should not have survived by any rational calculation. His name was Walter Greer. He was 81 years old. He had been sleeping in the drainage ditch below the overpass, not by accident and not by confusion, but by a deliberate and practiced arrangement that indicated he had been doing so for some weeks. A military surplus sleeping bag inside a plastic ground sheet. Boots placed precisely. A canvas rucksack wedged against the embankment with what turned out to be everything he still owned secured inside it. He had not been drinking. His vitals, when the paramedics reached him, were remarkably stable for a man who had spent 47 minutes beneath a collapsed overpass with a slab of roadway 6 inches above his face. His pulse was elevated, but regular. His breathing was controlled, and when the paramedics asked him his name, he gave it without hesitation and added, unprompted, his blood type and his service number. Walter had served 22 years in the United States Army. He had been a staff sergeant with the 173rd Airborne Brigade, with deployments to Vietnam in 1968 and 1969, including a period in the Central Highlands that he would speak about only obliquely and only when directly asked, and later a deployment to Germany during the Cold War years, and a final tour in Panama in 1989. He had been decorated 4 times. He carried a Silver Star and 2 Purple Hearts in the rucksack. Not in a frame, not in a box, but folded in a piece of oilcloth, the way a man carries the things he cannot leave behind, but no longer has a place to display. He had been homeless for 11 months. Not lost, not confused. Homeless, a word he used himself, flatly and without apology. The way a man uses a word he has made peace with, even if the peace cost him something. The story of how Walter Greer had arrived at a drainage ditch in Gallatin, Tennessee, from 22 years of military service and 40 years of subsequent life as a machinist, and then a maintenance supervisor, and then a widower living on a fixed income in a house in Murfreesboro. That story took some time to extract. Partly because Walter was economical with words by nature, and partly because the hospital had him on pain medication for the cracked rib and the lacerations from the debris, and the medication made him slower than he wanted to be. The short version was a man named Dennis Pryor. Dennis Pryor was 53 years old and operated a property management company out of Murfreesboro that handled, among other things, the building in which Walter had rented a one-bedroom apartment for 9 years. When Walter's wife Ruth had died of a stroke in the spring of the previous year, Dennis Pryor had appeared at Walter's door within 6 weeks with a lease renewal that contained, buried in its third addendum, a clause reclassifying Walter's unit from residential standard to a supportive living arrangement that allowed the management company to charge an additional $712 per month in care coordination fees for services Walter had never requested, never received, and never been told were being arranged on his behalf. The reclassification had been filed with the County Housing Authority the same week Ruth died, when Walter had been in no condition to read anything carefully, and he had signed the renewal without understanding what he was signing. By the time Walter's daughter in Memphis had noticed the charge on his bank statement and called to ask about it, 7 months of the fee had been collected, $4,984 drawn from Walter's Social Security and VA pension, which together came to $1,100 a month. After the $712 fee and the regular rent, Walter had been left with less than $60 a month. He had not told his daughter. He had not told anyone, because he was a man who had survived the Central Highlands in 1968 and did not believe in burdening people with problems he thought he could still solve himself. He had stopped eating 2 meals a day and reduced to 1, and had sold Ruth's jewelry and his own television, and had finally, in the 11th month, quietly vacated the apartment and moved what he could carry into the drainage ditch. Because the drainage ditch was covered and dry, and he had nowhere else to go that would not require him to admit to someone that he had failed to protect the life he and Ruth had built. He had not failed, he had been robbed, but he did not yet know the language to say that cleanly. Nora Voss sat in the hallway outside Walter's room at Vanderbilt University Medical Center and listened to the intake nurse explain the situation to the social worker on call, and felt something that was not quite anger and not quite grief, but occupied the territory between them. The specific, cold clarity of a person who has identified an injustice and is now deciding what to do about it. Recon sat at her feet. He had a cut across his left shoulder from a piece of rebar he'd brushed during the search. Nothing deep. Nothing that required more than cleaning and a bandage the vet had applied that morning, but the titanium plate leg had borne more stress than usual in the rubble field, and he moved it with slightly more deliberateness than his norm. He had not let Nora leave Walter's room until the medical team had asked her to step out, and even then he had positioned himself in the hallway, facing the door, not the corridor, and had remained in that orientation through the 2 hours that followed. Some dogs work. Recon had decided, apparently, that his work tonight was Walter Greer, and he was not finished. Nora made call. The first was to a veterans legal aid clinic in Nashville she had used once before on behalf of a contractor friend. She had the number in her phone because she was a person who kept numbers she might need and believed in being useful before problems required it. The clinic connected her to an attorney named Marcus Webb, who handled predatory housing cases and elder financial exploitation, and who, when Nora laid out the care coordination fee scheme, said, "I've seen this exact structure before," with a flatness that told her he meant it, and that it made him angry in the same controlled way that it made her angry. The second call was to the County Housing Authority to report the reclassification filing and request the date of record. The third was to the Tennessee Department of Commerce and Insurance, which regulated property management companies, to file a complaint against prior property management. The fourth was to Walter's daughter, Claudette, in Memphis, whom Nora reached at 7:15 in the morning and who did not cry on the phone. She was her father's daughter, but whose breathing changed in a way that said everything it needed to say. Claudette arrived in Gallatin by noon. She was 53 years old, a retired schoolteacher, and she walked into her father's hospital room and took his hand and sat beside him for a long time without speaking, and when she did speak it, was to tell him that she was not angry at him, and then to ask Recon, with the directness of a woman who recognized that the dog had done something she could not quantify, what kind of treats he preferred. Recon put his head on Walter's bed and left it there. Dennis Pryor's attorney contacted Marcus Webb in the third week of November, after the Housing Authority review had flagged 11 separate units in Pryor's portfolio that carried the same care coordination clause, 8 of them occupied by elderly or disabled tenants, 6 of them collecting the fee from people who had never received any identifiable coordinated care service of any kind. The attorney's initial position was that the fees were disclosed in the lease addendum and therefore not fraudulent. Marcus Webb's response was 12 pages long and cited 4 separate Tennessee statutes. Pryor's attorney did not respond for 10 days. By January, the Department of Commerce and Insurance had suspended Pryor's property management license, pending investigation. By March, a civil suit filed on behalf of 9 affected tenants, Walter Greer among them, had proceeded to mediation. Dennis Pryor settled in April for a combined restitution of $218,000, distributed among the plaintiffs in proportion to the amounts extracted, with Walter's share accounting for the full $4,984 plus interest and legal fees. Pryor's license was permanently revoked in June. His company dissolved. His name came off the buildings. By the following spring, Walter Greer had a 1-bedroom apartment in a veteran priority complex in Murfreesboro, 12 miles from the house where he and Ruth had lived for 30 years. The apartment had a porch that faced a courtyard, and on Saturday mornings he sat on that porch with his coffee and read, which was something he had not done in over a year, because the act of sitting still in a specific place with no urgent necessity had ceased to feel available to him. It was available to him now. He was learning to accept that. Nora drove out from Gallatin on the first Saturday of each month. She brought Recon, who had been cleared by the vet for full activity by February, and who showed it by bounding out of the truck each time with an enthusiasm that always startled Walter slightly and then made him laugh. Recon would go directly to Walter's chair, press his head against the old man's knee, hold it there for a moment, and then settle at his feet for the rest of the visit. On the third visit, Walter had produced a dog biscuit from his shirt pocket, with the ceremony of a man who had given considerable thought to the correct occasion. "Saved these from last week," Walter said. For the veteran, Recon took the biscuit with the careful dignity of an animal who understood when something was being offered with weight behind it. Nora watched the old man and the dog in the Saturday morning light and felt the thing she had been cautiously allowing herself to feel since Recon had pressed his muzzle into that gap in the rubble and whined. Not pride, not satisfaction exactly, but something quieter. The sense of a circle closed, of 2 people who had been ground down by separate machines finding, on the same embankment, the same stubborn refusal to stay down. She had come home from deployment looking for something she hadn't been able to name. She had not expected to find part of it in a drainage ditch outside Gallatin at 5 in the morning, guided there by a dog who simply would not leave. The shoulder from the rebar cut had healed without a scar. The plate in Recon's leg held. On the mornings she watched him shake the sleep off and move through the kitchen to the door with his ground-covering, deliberate stride, she did not think about what the vet had said about time and progression. She thought about a rubble field in the dark, and a dog who had pressed his nose into a gap in 40 tons of concrete and found, against every rational expectation, that something was still breathing underneath it. She thought about the quality of that certainty, the way he had known before she did. The way he had looked back at her once and then stopped looking back because there was no longer any question about what happened next. That, she thought, was the thing about loyalty that was hardest to explain to people who hadn't seen it up close. It doesn't calculate odds. It doesn't negotiate with probability. It simply identifies what it will not leave and stays. Sometimes miracles arrive as sound before they arrive as sight. A dog whining into a crack in the dark, steady and deliberate, refusing to be called away. Sometimes God sends the rescue not in the form of the professionals with the lights and the equipment and the established protocols, but through someone who stopped to fill a tank and let their dog stretch his legs and heard the thing that no one else was close enough to hear. Walter Greer had survived the Central Highlands in 1968. He had survived Vietnam and Cold War Germany and Panama and 40 years of civilian life, and the death of his wife and a landlord who had looked at an 80-year-old widower on a fixed income and seen an opportunity. He had survived all of it. The last thing he needed to survive was the belief that the world had stopped noticing he was still in it. A wounded dog with a titanium plate in his leg proved otherwise. That is not a coincidence. That is the kind of quiet, specific grace that does not announce itself, but does not fail to arrive. If this story touched your heart, share it with someone who needs to be reminded that the world still finds the people it is not finished with. Leave a comment and tell us where you're watching from, and if you've ever met someone who carried their service quietly and asked for nothing in return, we would be honored to hear about them. Their story may be the one that changes how someone else looks at the person sitting alone. And if you believe in stories of courage, loyalty, and the stubborn grace of ordinary people, please subscribe to the channel so you never miss the next journey. May God bless you, protect your family, and keep you close to the ones who would not leave your side, on 4 legs or 2.